All right. Good morning, class. Good afternoon, whatever the heck time it is you're watching this. Some of you are probably watching this late at night. Um, we're moving on from Greece to Rome. And of course, the Roman Empire revolutionized the world. It's uh, far flung, sprawling, uh, very multicultural. Um, so we're going to take a look at that. I'm starting just at the beginning. Realize that Rome was, unlike a lot of other empires, Rome really set out to make the world Roman. They weren't just interested in conquering, they were looking to Romanize the people that they conquered. And this was the mark of the empire. Um, they wanted people to adopt Roman uh, government. They left the culture in a lot of ways largely intact. Okay, the actual culture. Um, but as far as ways of management, of organizing cities, etc., they really did work on building their empire. Um, the Greeks uh, were very idyllic, um, but uh, the Romans were more focused on current events, real people, than they were gods. Um, that's not to say that they didn't display gods via their art, via their culture, but there was a lot of focus on reality, I guess, more so than we've seen in uh, some of the other cultures that we've studied. Um, Also, we're going to talk about the patriarchy and what that means and how that's a very Roman concept, the rule of the father. Okay, so looking at 183, we realize that the Roman culture really came out of kind of a combination of two cultures. One being the Greek culture, okay, and the others being the Etruscans, okay. Etruscans, part of I'm sorry, Etruria, part of the Iberian Peninsula that Rome was located on there in Italy, as we see on 182. Um, what I think is really cool, one of the things that's just really cool is the tombs, right? The tumulus, which is a structure it's basically, from what we can tell, what their actual houses would have looked like. Now, the actual houses have been destroyed, but because the tumulus was put, excuse me, underground, they've been largely preserved. Okay, so we get an idea of what the domestic life of the Etruscans was likely like from the tombs. Um, Women played a much bigger part in Etruscan society, and that ended up being mirrored in Roman society. Um, we see husband and wife in very equitable poses. They didn't have all the rights, but it was much closer than what we see in Greeks. Um, go too deep there. Okay, well, let's talk about some of the history and geography of Rome. Rome was built in a confluence of seven hills. Okay, so the advantage, of course, with being built in hills is it's a very defensible position. Um, the Tiber River uh, gives a trade route going north, as well as access to a seaport to the south. So it's really kind of ideally situated for both defense and trade. Um, the Etruscan myth of the founding of Rome had to do with Romulus and Remus, twins left to die on the banks of the river. Okay, um, but they were raised by a she-wolf supposedly, and the she-wolf suckled them, and they ended up being raised by a shepherd who was going to build a city where he found them. Um, and the uh, the two boys ended up fighting over which one would rule the city. And Romulus killed his brother, and since his brother's dead, he gets to found the city. So um, this is the legend of the founding of Rome from the Etruscan perspective. Um, excuse me. Uh, there's also a very one of the things that Rome drew on from the Greeks was this idea of the rights of the citizen. Okay, that being a citizen of Rome, just like being a citizen of the Greek polis, entitled one to certain rights, and that was important. Um, One of the ways that this ended up playing out, um, the Emperor Tiberius removed a statue from public display and put it in his bedroom, and the citizens uh, almost rioted over the removal of this statue from public display to the emperor's bedroom because they felt that it was theirs just as much as it was his. Um, we'll talk a little bit about Aeneas more later and the Aeneid. Um, the the Greeks really kind of brought to Rome the idea of art, the idea of rhetoric, the idea of studying science. This was all very important to Rome, okay? Um, but what Rome felt that they did better than the Greeks was put this all into play in ruling. Um, the Greeks had all their little cities, which did end up forming a formidable empire, especially when Alexander kind of took it over. But Rome centralized things, and Rome had a Roman way of doing things. Um, okay, um, so let's talk a little bit about class in Rome and how that worked. So in Rome, you had, excuse me, sorry, got a little bit of a tickle in my throat. So Rome had the patricians, and the patricians were the landowners. They were priests, they were judges, they were senators, and then you had the plebeians, who were the common people. Okay, these were craftspeople, these were laborers, these were merchants, um, and so you have this group of people who own the land, and people had to pledge their loyalty to a patrician. So if you were of a lower class, you had to find somebody of a higher class to pledge your loyalty to, and they in turn were supposed to look out for you. Um, Now, the Senate, okay, was made up of the patricians. All right, the plebeians that ended up forming the Concilium Plebis, or the Council of Plebeians, to make laws as well. But the patricians, the Senate's like, these really have no impact on us. So they basically ignored them. It wasn't until 287 BCE that the laws of the plebeians actually had an impact on the patricians. Um, This is okay. So we talked about the patricians. This is where the term patronage and also the term patriarchy comes from, because patriarch refers to the father. Okay, the pater, the father. And so when we talk about the patriarchy now, we're really referring to the rule of the father, or a male-dominated society. Um, Rome. So let's go from there. We're going to talk about the Punic Wars. Now, the Punic Wars are this series of wars between Rome and Carthage. Okay, Carthage is a city in northern Africa, um, and this went on for about 100 years. Okay, these series of wars, um, and whereas Rome controlled north, kind of Europe and east a little bit, Carthage controlled Africa and or a good part of northern Africa and into the Mediterranean. And Hannibal actually was able to get the Roman general, or the I'm sorry, the Carthaginian general Hannibal, uh, basically laid waste to most of northern Italy, defeated an army of about 80,000 men, um, and the Hannibal never lost a battle. But what Rome was able to do was very carefully cut off his supplies. It takes a lot of food to feed an elephant, okay? And he was able to get elephants over the Alps. Um, and finally, he had to go back to Carthage because he couldn't keep his army fed. He couldn't get supplies. Um, and after basically not losing a battle for 15 years, he had to go home, um, and was eventually defeated on his home territory. And when Rome de- beat Carthage, they destroyed it, they leveled it, they salted the earth. They wanted to make sure that Carthage never came back, that it was gone permanently from the face of the world. Um, okay, now one of the interesting things about Rome, and this is a big part of what led to their success, as long as you pledged loyalty to the Roman Empire, Rome had no problem with you. So Rome would go into a territory, into a country, they would conquer it, they would leave behind Roman veterans, they would give them land in this new territory. And you'd think this would lead, having these soldiers stationed there would lead to people wanting to rise up against them. But what these soldiers would do, they went from soldiers to engineers, and they started building things like aqueducts and bridges. And it's like, yeah, the soldiers are here, but damn, they're doing some really cool stuff. And as long as we pay our taxes, they're going to keep doing stuff, and they're going to protect us from anybody else. Yes, they're here, but they're going to make sure that maybe somebody worse who isn't really trying to build bridges and plumbing uh, won't come in and conquer us. So this was actually a very smart strategy on Rome's part. Rome allowed people to keep their own religion as long as they paid taxes. Keep your own religion. We don't care about the color of your skin. We don't care where you're from. We don't care what you believe. Is your loyalty first and foremost to Rome? If it is, we will protect you, we will look out for you, and we will build public works for you. And so it's kind of, you've got this massive stick of Roman military might in one hand, and you've got this beautiful carrot of Roman technology and protection in the other. And this worked for centuries to keep the Roman Empire together. All right, let's start talking about the foundation of really Rome as an empire. Uh, Pompey the Great came back from uh, from a campaign in Asia Minor, and he was going to give certain territories and lands to his soldiers. This is what he had promised them. And the Senate, when he came back, said, "No, we're not going to do that." And this pissed Pompey off. Um, and so he joined with two other powerful military forces. One was Cassius. We don't hear a lot about Cassius. The other one is Julius Caesar, Gaius Julius Caesar. Um, and the three of them together formed the first triumvirate. They uh, ended up dominating the political scene in very short order because they were well respected, well liked by the troops of Rome, and because people were not that trustful of the Senate. Um, Pompey, the triumvirate soon fractured with Caesar taking control. Cassius didn't last very long, and eventually Pompey even fled to Greece and, or I'm sorry, to Egypt, where he was murdered. Okay. At this point, Caesar starts really treating the Senate with basically no respect. He saw the Senate as being disrespectful of him, and he didn't see any reason to respect the Senate. Um, so he met. He ended up meeting with the Senate on the Ides of March, and he was stabbed to death by the senators, about 60 of them. Uh, and one of his allies, Brutus, was among the people who killed him. And this is where Shakespeare's line, "Et tu, Brute, you too, Brutus," comes from. Um, okay, uh, Caesar already had a succession plan in place. His nephew Gaius Octavius, who came to be known as Octavian, uh, took over. He quickly defeated his main rival, Marcus Antonius, um, or Mark Antony, as we know him. Now, what's interesting is Octavian was smart enough to turn around, and after he beats Octavian's like, we can keep at it, or you can join me. And Mark Antony saw the wisdom in this, at least initially, and he and another gentleman by the name of Marcus Aemilius Lepidus joined with Octavian to form the second triumvirate. Um, Cassius Brutus were pursued into Macedonia, beaten in the Battle of Philippi, and they then divided up the empire among the three of them, making it easier to govern. Lepidus ruled in Africa. Mark Antony ruled the eastern part of the empire, including Egypt. And then, of course, Octavian, he got Rome for himself. Lepidus ended up plotting against Octavian, but Octavian actually persuaded his troops to abandon him, which you can't fight a war with if the troops aren't with you. Antony ends up forming an alliance with Cleopatra, and of course we know the legends of Antony and Cleopatra. Cleopatra's great beauty, and Octavian beat them in combat, and Antony and Cleopatra, of course, committed suicide. According to Shakespeare, Cleopatra allowed snakes or asps to bite her. Okay, Cicero. Let's talk about Cicero, page 190. Cicero, the Latin language went through a very similar transformation that English has gone through. Okay, the educated of Rome initially all spoke Greek, and texts were written in Greek, and they felt that Greek was the language of scholars. All right. Cicero saw the power of the vernacular being the language of the people, okay, which was Latin, and felt that things should be spoken in Latin, taught in Latin, and the power of the Latin language to unify people throughout the empire. Okay, so Cicero was also very blunt. He was a very straightforward speaker, and he could move people as few other speakers could. Excuse me. Cicero was very outspoken against Caesar, as well as the Second Triumvirate. Was not trusting of them, and so eventually the Second Triumvirate had enough of him and had him executed. All right. If we remember, kind of looking back at a lot of the Greek statues, okay, they were very idealistic, right? These perfect bodies, these beautiful forms, okay. This was what was to be strived for. Roman sculpture was not like that. They were very realistic. They captured, in general, not always. I mean, we see there Augustus on 191, right? Trying to be like Apollo, the sun god. Okay, but in general, when sculpture was made, a lot of times the men were older, they had furrowed brows, right? There was a sincereness, a depth of emotion, an intensity that we don't see with the Greeks, because the Greeks were going for an ideal. Um, Whereas the Romans were trying to capture this powerful father figure. Okay? Excuse me. All right. Um, 191. Octavian ended up coming before the Senate and going, you know what, I'm going to give up my power, I'm going to just render this. And the Senate's like, no, please don't. And this was all a sham. Um, he, uh, he took Syria, he took all of the Iberian Peninsula, which happened to contain 20 of the 26 Roman legions, which basically assured him of any military support that he wanted. Um, he wasn't just announced as consul of Rome, but rather imperium, or the emperor, to give orders without restraint over all of Italy and all Roman-controlled territory. And he agreed to this very reluctantly. Um, and he was granted the semi-divine title of Augustus, the revered one. So here we have Augustus Caesar. Um, Now, he maintained the appearance of the republic. Okay, Senate stayed in place, but he soon eliminated the difference between patricians and the equites, and fostered the careers of anybody who was capable. Okay, he cared less about class distinction and more about the ability of somebody to get the job done. And this part was actually a very good thing for the empire, because it allowed the cream of the crop to rise, uh, based not on their lineage, but rather on their ability. Uh, when you can put the best person in charge rather than the fourth son of some guy who just happens to be a noble, you tend to get better results. Um, he was very much a about the family life of Rome. Uh, the Romans were very free sexually. He was very against this. Tried to return the family to its proper place. Um, his wife Livia was a big part of that. She's depicted in this uh, South frieze that we see there on 193 as holding the family together. She was this idealized woman, and she actually sponsored architectural projects herself. She was very involved in the empire. Um, they had all the rights of citizenship, though they could not vote or hold public office. So there was a limit, but as far as controlling their own property and controlling their own destiny, that was a part of it. Um, Girls were educated just like boys were. Um, they learned to read, they learned to write, many of them learned rhetoric, philosophy, literature, um, which was, of course, taught by Greek slaves. Um, the Humanitas, considered the equivalent of the Greek paideia, educating a person into their true self, into their genuine form, okay? Uh, Based out of Plato's concepts of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, as well as grammar and rhetoric. So bringing all of that together. Um, Most Romans were bilingual. They spoke both Greek and Latin. Okay, again, Greek being the language of the scholar. But again, Cicero was trying to make a push for this, for the rise of Latin. Um, because the Greeks taught the Roman children learned Greek values. They learned Greek philosophy. Um, Now, two of the more common philosophic uh, concepts, one was Epicureanism, the other one was Stoicism. Okay, Epicureanism is based on this idea that fear is what controls us, and in order to live our best lives, we have to let go of fear. There is no one answer. There is no afterlife. There's none of all this. Life's just random. Um, Now, Epicurus himself actually believed that uh, you still should live a good life. But unfortunately, what this philosophy often led to was a very hedonistic lifestyle, living in the moment, living for pleasure. Okay? Stoicism was the opposite of that, and this really appealed to a lot of Romans. Stoicism, this idea that life is hard, and we have to endure, and we have to just deal with what is thrown at us. We can't change everything, so we just have to bear the weight of it. And of course, what this leads to is, well, you can't really change anything, so why even try? Um, so problems really on both ends. Um, by submitting one's emotion to the practice of reason, one could achieve tranquility of mind. Um, and this, like I said, because so many Romans were just struggling to get by in Rome. I mean, it was hard to live there. There wasn't enough space. I mean, you're surrounded by hills on all sides and the river, so no place to go. You were living in these horrible apartment type things that weren't well maintained and were highly flammable. Um, it's like, okay, we just got to get through, and this is nobility is just getting through. Um, all right, some of the poetry of Rome, 195, right? Um, Catullus um, wrote a series of poems about a very short-lived affair that he had, um, referring to her as Lesbia, which is a clear reference, again, if we go back to our Greeks, Lesbia, clear reference to the island of Lesbos. Um, from Sappho, poem we talked about with the poet that we talked about with the Greeks. Um, and while during the Civil Wars, other scholars or other poets tended to lose their property and their holdings, Catullus got the favor of Augustus. And, when the emperor likes you, you tend to be okay. Okay. All right. The Aeneid. Um, you had to, okay, so if you're a poet, you really had to have, again, a patrician, somebody to look out for you. Um, so it served you well to appeal to the upper classes, to write something that would appeal to them. And so Virgil wrote the Aeneid, um, another tale of Rome's founding, in order to gain the patronage, the favor of the emperor. Okay, written in dactylic hexameter. All right. So again, we come back to the dactyl, right? That long, short, short. Okay, or the spondy, long, long, dumb, dumb. Okay, and the hexameter, 6 feet of that. Okay, so either 6 dactyls or 6 spondies in some combination. Um, it's the Aeneid is a tale of Rome's founding, but it also deals with just human destiny, human fate, and how do you maintain a culture? How do you create and maintain a culture? And this is really what the Aeneid gets into. All right, Horace. Um, Horace, it doesn't really address this here, but it's something I want to mention, and that is what's called the Horatian platitude. The Horatian platitude, and which says that the purpose of poetry, and by poetry what we really mean is, yes, a poem, but also a play or now we would say short stories, novels, uh, any type of narrative, right? Any of this, the purpose is to both instruct and delight. Instruct and delight. In other words, I want you to learn something from what I am writing, but I want you to enjoy it as well. Okay? So when we talk about the Horatian platitude, we're talking about the concept of to instruct and delight. He wrote many odes. These are lyric poems that have elaborate meters, but often irregular. They don't have a consistent meter. So that those feet that we were talking about, the various meters, they're not consistent. Um, Briefly, um, Ovid's Art of Love and his Metamorphosis. A lot of these other poets we're talking about wrote very dignified works. Ovid Ovid wrote what would now probably be the equivalent of overly sexualized comic books. Okay, um, he liked love songs and he liked to get into really descriptive turns of phrase and um, we talked about all the different places where love could happen and how to go about it, and women like sex too, right? So there's all these things, and the funny thing about he knew it. He knew that he wasn't like these other guys, and he was like, I wish I was, but that's okay. I'm good. Okay. Um, all right. When Augustus took over, um, we think about Roman cities as these very neat, organized things. There's a place for everything. They did grid systems in their cities, right? So it was easy to find everything and easy to move through all of their cities, right? Except Rome. Rome grew up very organically, and when they expanded their empire, they had a plan, but nobody had a plan when Rome was just growing up, when it was becoming. And so Rome was this disorganized mess that's all over the place. And Augustus knew this when he took over. Um, and so what Augustus did, and this is a thing that became the hallmark of the Roman attitude, and this is public works. We're going to build a city and we're going to make it better, and we're going to make things available to everyone. So, um, for example, aqueducts, the ability to get water to anywhere in the city, right? We'll talk more about that. They basically came up with the apartment building, um, the insula, it was called. Um, and these were often 4 or 5 stories tall. Everybody had 2 rooms, typically a bedroom and a living room, and kind of shared uh, eating areas, and often shared, if there was such a thing, um, which a lot of times there wasn't, uh, bathing areas. Okay, um, they just dumped the chamber pots where you piss and shit out into the street outside, and it when you end up with these massive apartment buildings without really places for them to go, they ended up getting run down. They were often cheaply built. They were highly flammable. We'll talk more about that later. Um, he said that Augustus said, I found a city of brick and I left a city of marble. To a degree, this was true. Okay, but really, what he kind of did was he covered up the brick with a marble veneer, a marble surface. Um, there were still a lot of problems. He covered them up, but he didn't fix them all. The public works helped. Getting more water into the city helped. Repaving streets helped. Okay, but it didn't fix the underlying issues. Uh, Yeah, the we've got like the Aqua Claudia delivered water 40 miles away from the city, right? This massive work, which is amazing. But maybe it could have been used for the people. Instead, it was used for like fountains and public bathhouses. So it's like you do something that you say is for the people, but then it doesn't get directly to the people itself. I'm sure we're familiar with this concept. Um, More and more Republican values were lost. The Senate kept losing power under the further dynasties, um, from Nero, Tiberius, the later Caesars. Um, there was always the concern of who was going to be next. None of the Julio Claudian emperors had sons, and so like they were looking around for more extended family members to be heirs. Um, the Emperor Tiberius uh, has a series of trials for what he called Majestas Minutia Populi Romani, or diminishing the majesty of the Roman people. In other words, if you do something that makes Rome look bad, we're going to put you on trial. Well, this could be anything. I mean, who's to say what makes Rome look bad? And let's face it, we're facing this same type of issue still today. Um, it hasn't gotten to the point of law yet, but there's certainly the public response, right? Um, so when Tiberius basically, this law basically allowed Tiberius to take out anybody that he wanted to. People got really sick of Tiberius. When he died, people were happy to see Caligula ascend the throne, and then within 2 years, Caligula was fighting with the Senate, and Caligula was known by the time he died for just being, well, a horrible human being. Um, he was actually murdered. His successor, Claudius, um, didn't trust the Senate anymore, so he started putting members of the Senate on trial. Um, then Claudius died, and then Nero took over, and who Nero was, many people felt, basically insane. Um, he took over at 16 years of age. He ruled well initially. Um, he was having an affair, though, with someone from Pompeii. Nero tried to have his mom killed. Yay for, Mother's Day didn't go well there. Um, Fire ended up destroying a large amount of the apartments, the insulae, during Nero's reign. He tried to put in a building code to prevent that from happening again, which was often not abided by, unfortunately. Um, he confiscated a large part of the land to build himself what he called the Golden House, which is basically his own palace. But he also did build the Colosseum, and we can see the images of that on page 201. Nero was eventually came to be decried as an enemy of the state, and he ended up committing suicide. And so one of his generals, took over, and Vespasian built the Colosseum across from Nero's Golden House, which is an interesting move, isn't it? Because what he was doing by building the Colosseum across from the Golden House is like, okay, this is private, right? This is this private place that this previous guy built, but I'm going to build something for the public in the Colosseum. And of course, this is where we end up seeing a lot of these famous gladiator fights. This is where a lot of Christians were persecuted and killed, eaten by animals. This is where the people of Rome gathered to watch the circuses. And the idea of bread and circuses, right? If you entertain the people and you keep them fed, you can get away with anything. And the Colosseum allowed that to happen. Okay. While Vespasian ruled, Titus, his son, defeated the Jews in Judea because they felt that the Romans were interfering with their religious practices. Okay. And here we're going to get to Mount Vesuvius and the destruction of Pompeii here shortly. After the Flavian dynasty, Vespasian, Titus, Domitian, Rome had the 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. And during this time, each man was selected. They didn't have a son. They didn't have anybody that they could pass their line on to. And so each man was selected by the Senate based on their ability to rule. And this is why during this time we see Rome really prosper, really do well. Okay? Um, Unfortunately, Marcus Aurelius did have a son, Commodus. If I remember right, Commodus, if you watched the movie Gladiator, that's him. Commodus was insane. And Marcus Aurelius, um, the work of the five good emperors, Commodius basically almost single-handedly undid as far as the stability of Rome. Okay, the Parthenon, the Pantheon, not to be mistaken for the Parthenon of Athens. The Pantheon is an amazing, amazing structure. If you look there on 207, massive dome and largest built in Europe, all the way up until the 20th century. Okay, so really for what about 1900 years, this is the largest dome structure in Europe. Nobody outdid it. 144-foot rotunda, which is also the height from floor to ceiling, 30-foot opening in the ceiling, which represents the eye of Jupiter looking down. They had slits in the floor so that if water came in there, it would drain out. You see the coffers, right? The little recesses in this dome. And what's wonderful about those is that keeps so much weight on that thing. Okay, so you don't need as much support to support it as you would if it was solid. It also creates that beautiful lighting effect that you see there, kind of that swirl effect. And it moves as the sun moves, right? As the sun moves, that light that comes through that moves through the Pantheon. Um, we also have here 208, the column of Trajan, which it's basically a giant story told in artistic form. 150 scenes that, if you just rolled it out, would go about 625 feet. Just think of it as, again, I guess, a massive comic book that you could watch, if you could ever find a way to do so. Um, Something like, 2,500 different figures. Okay. All right, Pompeii. Pompeii is a city. It's not one of the most important cities of the Roman Empire at the time. Okay, we think of it as greater than it actually was now because of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. In 79 CE, right? It buried Pompeii in 13 feet of volcanic ash and rock, and its neighboring city of Herculaneum was covered in 75 foot of hot ash that solidified. Now, this is obviously a tragedy. Of the 20,000 people in the area, killed roughly 2,000. Okay. What it did, though, was it preserved the way of life of Rome, of a Roman citizen in one of these towns, because that hot ash, that volcanic ash, the magma comes down and it cools and it hardens around all of these towns, buries them, and everything is almost perfectly preserved in these towns. And Pompeii has been a treasure trove of information about Roman life because so much was just so well preserved inside of that volcanic stone. Pliny the Younger was staying with his uncle, Pliny the Elder, who was a commander in the Roman army. Pliny the Elder brilliantly decided to go look at the volcano as it was erupting, and the poisonous fumes killed him. But Pliny the Younger took detailed notes, wrote about what happened, and we know much of what we know from him. We get a good idea of the townhomes of the wealthiest citizens from here because Pompeii was a resort town. by and large. We see the baths, we see the homes of the wealthy there, and the having a domus, and from which we get the term domicile, right? Yeah, this is my domicile, um, was a mark of social standing. Um, so 210 really describes how the difference between the wealthy and the poor were, right? The poor lived in these little, in these giant apartments. The wealthy lived in the domus. The front door was open, left open. The atrium, okay, the open area would fill with people who were plebeians sworn to this particular patrician. Um, they would show their respect in the ritual known as the salutario or the salute. Um, they would bring problems, ask questions, right? And people could just look in the door and see them there, right? And it was a mark of your standing that you had many people coming to see you. So we get a feel for how these spaces worked, again, by and large, from uh, Pompeii. All right, 214. Okay, the late Roman Empire and what how big, the beginning of the fall of Rome as as the Roman Empire. Okay, um, many of the late emperors were Romanized provincials. Okay, they weren't from Rome proper. Again, one of the things about Rome, Rome didn't care where you were from. Rome didn't care about your skin color. Rome didn't care about your religion. Were you good at what you did? That's what mattered. Did you have fealty to the Roman Empire? Um, the emperors Trajan and Hadrian were born on the Iberian Peninsula. Okay, that's Spain. Septimus Severus, the founder of the Severian dynasty, which followed the Commodus, right, um, was African. Okay, now when I say African, he was from Africa. He wasn't necessarily, and probably not from what we can tell, he was not black African. Because remember, there were a lot, especially there in that eastern part, settled. He was probably Phoenician. Um, but he sure as hell wasn't Italian. Okay? Two of his successors were actually Syrian, so Middle Eastern. All right? So this is what Rome cared about. Not did you come from the Italian peninsula, but were you Roman? And did you have loyalty to Roman ideals? Um, so Rome ended up being threatened uh, by the Germanic barbarians, okay, the Goths, and then the Visigoths or the Western Goths. Um, there was a lot of unrest in the empire. Um, there were just the Roman legions were unable to hold back the barbarians. There was quick succession of emperors as people fought to be uh, to take control. And what made things even harder was that, remember, Rome had accepted anybody in, right, as long as you were willing to swear loyalty. So a lot of these quote unquote barbarians, and we use barbarians basically means they're not Romans, had actually studied in Rome. Attila the Hun, right, studied Rome, studied had Roman teachers. So there's the, there was this pressure on Rome from the outside that was really unprecedented, and that Rome didn't handle it well. And then you have this pressure from Christianity against the moral debauchery of Rome, right? Um, and so, which Christianity was growing rapidly across multiple parts of the empire, okay? Um, fighting against, and like they were fighting against things like public bathing houses, because well, bad things can happen in the bathhouse. It's material excess. It's a focus on materiality rather than spirituality. Um, and so they the empire finds itself in opposition with a cultural opposition to a large part of its population. Um, this Christians define themselves first and foremost as Christians, and secondly as Romans. Okay, and this for Rome, you could be a Christian, but you were a Roman first. And when Christians said, we are Christians first instead of Romans, and we will abide by Christian principles before that, those of Rome, this is where Rome came in conflict with it. If they had said, fine, we are Roman citizens and we're going to practice Christianity, Rome would have said, good on you. But by saying we're Christians first and we insist that Christian principles as we understand them are followed ahead of those of Rome, this is where the conflict came into being. Romans tended to blame Christians for a lot of the problems of the empire, for undermining Roman values. There was persecution of them until finally we see Constantine. And Constantine was the first quote-unquote Christian emperor. Now, there's a great deal of debate as to how Christian Constantine actually was. He's basically believed to have put on, by and large, a good front when he needed to, because he saw which way the winds were blowing. He initially said that, for example, he saw the Roman numeral 30 and the symbols chi and rho when he went to battle. He changed that to seeing the cross, and what chi and rho stands for was Christos, which means auspicious. When he first said it, by later in his life, he's like, no, yeah, it said Christos, but it meant Christ. So he ended up altering his story about what happened in order to get Christians to amalgamate into the Roman world. Constantine also would really relaunch a lot of the public works and usher in the era of the Christian Roman Empire. Okay, this is Rome. So please make sure that you are up to speed on your discussion boards. Very important. Again, this is attendance. If you have any questions, please hit me up on Remind, and have a beautiful day.